What starts as an ordinary coffee date becomes a deadly game of deception, betrayal, and impossible choices. When tech billionaire Mark Evans meets Sarah Miller for what he thinks is a simple blind date, he has no idea he's about to enter a world where nothing is what it seems and everyone has blood on their hands. Welcome back, beautiful people. This story is where drama meets devotion and where one glance can rewrite destiny. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Café Lumiere with the kind of relentless fury that only Manhattan could deliver. Mark Evans sat in the corner booth, his fingers drumming against the mahogany table as steam rose from his untouched espresso. The cafe buzzed with the comfortable white noise of evening conversations, but Mark might as well have been sitting in a tomb. His phone vibrated. Jake's name lit up the screen. "Tell me you didn't chicken out." Jake's voice crackled through the speaker. Mark's jaw tightened. "I'm here. Where the hell is she?" "Man, Sarah's always punctual. She'll be there." "Jake, I swear to God, this is another one of your disasters like that art teacher who collected vintage mannequin heads that was one time, and technically, those were antiques." Jake's laugh was too casual, too practiced. "Look, Sarah's different. Trust me on this one. Different." The word sat in Mark's chest like a stone. In his world, different usually meant damaged, complicated, or desperate. He'd built his tech empire on reading people, on spotting weaknesses and exploiting advantages. It's what made him rich. It's what kept him alone. The cafe door chimed, and Mark's attention snapped to the entrance. A woman stepped inside, shaking droplets from her midnight black hair. She moved with the kind of fluid grace that seemed to bend gravity around her, scanning the room with eyes that caught the warm lighting like polished obsidian. Mark's breath hitched. She wore a simple charcoal dress that somehow managed to be both understated and devastating. Her skin had an otherworldly pallor that suggested she rarely saw sunlight, and when she smiled at the barista, Mark noticed. Her lips held secrets. This couldn't be Sarah. Jake had described someone down-to-earth. Not your type. This woman looked like she could dismantle nations with a glance. She approached his table, and Mark stood too quickly, nearly knocking. Over his coffee, Mark Evans. Her voice was honey over broken glass. Sarah Miller. It wasn't a question. He'd seen the small photo Jake had shown him, but it had been grainy, taken from a distance. Nothing had prepared him for this. She slid into the seat across from him, and Mark caught a scent that made his chest tighten. Something expensive. Something dangerous. "You seem surprised," she said, tilting her head. "Jake didn't mention I'd grown fangs, did he?" Mark found himself laughing despite the warning bells clanging in his skull. "Something like that." Sarah's fingers traced the rim of her water glass, and Mark noticed her nails were bitten down to the quick. The first crack in her perfect facade. "So," she said, leaning forward slightly, "tell me about yourself, Mark Evans. What drives a man to build an empire before 30? The question hit him off guard. Most women started with safe territory, career highlights, or shared interests. Sarah dove straight for the throat. "Insomnia and spite, mostly," he said, matching her directness. She laughed, a sound that was equal parts music and blade. "Honest. I like that." Her eyes never left his face. "Most people lie within the first 5 minutes. You waited at least 3. What about you? What does Sarah Miller do when she's not ambushing men in coffee shops?" Something flickered across her features, too quick to catch. "I solve problems." "What kind of problems?" "The kind people pay well to forget." Mark's pulse quickened. In the back of his mind, every instinct he'd honed in the business world started screaming this wasn't a blind date. This was something else entirely. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. The screen lit up with an incoming call, and Mark glimpsed the caller ID before she could flip it face down. Victor Kozlov. Mark's blood turned to ice. He knew that name. Everyone in his circles knew that name. Was the kind of man who collected debts in blood and owned judges like other people own shoes. Sarah's eyes met his, and in that moment, Mark realized 2 things that would change everything. Sarah Miller had recognized the recognition in his face. and she was no more here for a blind date than he was here to fall in love. "Excuse me," she said, standing gracefully. "I need to take this." She walked toward the restroom. Phone pressed to her ear. Mark's mind raced. Jake's setup suddenly made sense in the worst possible way. This wasn't about finding love or expanding social circles. This was about the Meridian Project. The classified government contract that had put Mark's company on the map and painted a target on his back. The same contract that had made him rich enough to afford enemies like Viktor Kozlov. Mark's phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "How's it going? She's incredible, right?" Mark stared at the message, then at Sarah's retreating figure. Her posture had changed completely during the phone call. Gone was the playful woman who'd sat. Across from him, in her place stood someone who looked like she was receiving kill orders. When Sarah returned to the table 2 minutes later, her smile was perfectly in place, but her eyes had gone cold. "Sorry about that," she said, settling back into her seat. "Work emergency." "What kind of work keeps you busy on a Thursday night?" Sarah's smile never wavered, but Mark caught the slight tension in her shoulders. The kind that pays for coffee dates with handsome entrepreneurs. Mark leaned back, studying her face. Every survival instinct he possessed was telling him to leave, to get as far away from Sarah Miller as possible. But something else held him in place. Something darker than curiosity and more dangerous than attraction. "Sarah," he said quietly, "what do you know about the Meridian Project?" The color drained from her face so quickly that for a moment Mark thought she might faint. Then her features hardened into something beautiful and terrible. "I think," she said, her voice steady, "as a blade, we need to have a very different conversation." Sarah's apartment was nothing like Mark had expected. Located in a converted warehouse in Tribeca, it was all exposed brick and industrial fixtures. But every shadow seemed deliberate, every corner designed for concealment. The space felt like a beautiful cage. "Drink?" Sarah asked, moving to a bar cart that looked like it belonged in a 1940s film noir. Mark remained standing near the door, his hand never straying far from his phone. "I'm good. I prefer to stay sharp when people are trying to kill me." Sarah poured herself 3 fingers of whiskey. "Neat. No one's trying to kill you, Mark. Yet." The word "yet" hung in the air like smoke. Then explained Viktor Kozlov's phone call. Explain why my best friend suddenly decided I needed to meet someone different. Explain why you know about Meridian. Sarah took a long sip of whiskey before answering. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of exhaustion. "Your friend Jake doesn't know anything about this. Really did think he was setting you up on a harmless blind date with his colleague from the law firm. But you're not his colleague." "No." Sarah moved to the window, gazing out at the city lights. "Something much more complicated." Mark stepped deeper into the apartment, noting the way the floorboards didn't creak under his weight. Everything here was designed for silence. "What are you, Sarah?" She turned, and in the dim lighting, her beauty took on an edge that made Mark's chest tighten with something between desire and fear. "I'm a corporate intelligence specialist. Some people call it industrial espionage, but I prefer to think of it as information architecture. You steal secrets. I acquire truth." Sarah's smile was sharp enough to cut. "And 3 months ago, I was hired to acquire yours." Mark's hand moved instinctively to his phone, but Sarah held up her hand. "If I wanted you dead, you'd have been dead 20 minutes into our coffee date? There are 14 ways to kill someone with items found in any upscale cafe. I know 12 of them." Despite everything, Mark found himself almost impressed. "What stopped you?" Sarah finished her whiskey and set the glass down with deliberate precision. "You weren't what I expected." Meaning Viktor Kozlov told me you were a typical tech bro who stumbled into government contracts through luck and family connections. Someone soft. Someone who would crumble under pressure. Mark laughed, but there was no humor in it, and instead, I found someone who recognized Kozlov's name immediately. Someone who asked about Meridian without flinching. Someone who's been carrying a trauma response in his shoulders for months. The observation hit Mark like a physical blow. He'd spent years perfecting his poker face, but Sarah read him like he was written in neon. "What do you know about my trauma?" Sarah moved closer, and Mark caught that dangerous scent again. Up close, he could see the faint scar running along her collarbone, mostly hidden by her dress. I know about the car accident that killed your sister 3 years ago. I know you blame yourself because you were supposed to be in that car. I know you threw yourself into work to avoid dealing with the grief. And that's how you ended up developing the algorithm that caught the government's attention. Mark's hands clenched into fists. Stop. I know the Meridian Project isn't just about predictive analytics for national security. It's about preventing the kind of accidents that killed Emma. It's about building a system that could have saved her, I said. Stop it. Sarah stepped even closer. Close enough that Mark could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes. And I know that Viktor Kozlov's interest in your work has nothing to do with national security and everything to do with the fact that your algorithm could be worth billions on the black. Mark's breath came in short bursts. Nobody was supposed to know about Emma? Nobody was supposed to know about the real purpose behind his work. How do you know all of this? Sarah's expression softened, and for a moment, the dangerous intelligence operative disappeared, replaced by something achingly human. Because I've been watching you for 3 months, Mark, and in that time, I've seen you visit Emma's grave. Every Tuesday morning, I've seen you wake up screaming from nightmares in your penthouse apartment. I've seen you throw yourself into work that could revolutionize how we predict and prevent disasters. The room felt too small suddenly, the walls pressing in from all sides. And I've seen you slowly killing yourself with guilt that isn't yours to carry. Mark sank onto Sarah's leather couch, the weight of revelation crushing down on him. So what happens now? You deliver me to Kozlov? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. 3 months ago, yes. That was the plan, and now. Sarah looked out the window again, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. Now I'm about to do something incredibly stupid, which is... She turned back to him, and Mark saw something he hadn't expected in her eyes. Fear. Not for herself, but for him. I'm going to help you disappear. Mark's head snapped up. What? Kozlov doesn't just want your algorithm, Mark. He wants you to build him an entire network. A system that could predict and manipulate global events for profit. Stock crashes, natural disasters, political upheavals. In the wrong hands, your work could destabilize governments. And if I refuse? Sarah's jaw tightened. He'll kill everyone you've ever cared about, starting with Jake, and work his way through your entire social circle until you comply. The room spun around Mark. This was so much worse than he'd imagined. Why are you helping me? Sarah moved to her desk and opened a laptop. The screen displayed architectural plans, financial records, and what looked like escape routes marked in red. Because I've spent my entire adult life helping terrible people do terrible things, and I'm tired of being the villain in everyone else's story. She paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. And because Emma didn't die so that her brother could build weapons for war criminals. Mark felt something crack open in his chest. How do you know what Emma would have wanted? Sarah's smile was sad and beautiful and broken. Because I had a sister too. The weight of that revelation settled between them like a bridge neither had expected to build. Sarah, if you help me, what happens to you? She closed the laptop and looked at him with eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. I become a dead woman walking. But at least I'll be walking toward something that matters. Mark stood and moved toward her, drawn by something more powerful than fear or attraction. Something that felt like recognition. We could run together. Sarah shook her head. Kozlov will never stop hunting us. He'll tear apart everything and everyone until he finds what he wants. Then we make sure he can't. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Meaning? Mark pulled out his phone and showed her a screen she hadn't seen before. Lines of code that looked like poetry written in mathematics. Meaning I built a kill switch into the Meridian algorithm. Something that would destroy not just the program, but any system it's been integrated into. Sarah stared at the code, her expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something that might have been admiration. Ha! You destroy your own life's work. To keep it out of his hands? To protect the people I care about. Mark met her eyes. Emma taught me that some things are worth sacrificing everything for. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to memorize it. "Hey, there's something else you should know," she said finally. "Kozlov isn't the only one who wants you dead. Tomorrow morning, a federal task force is planning to arrest you for treason. Someone convinced them that you've already sold classified information to foreign governments." Mark's blood ran cold. "Who?" Sarah's expression was answer enough before she spoke. "The same person who's been feeding Kozlov information about your work for months? The same person who suggested Jake set up this blind date?" Mark felt the world tilt on its axis. "Jake." "No, Mark. The person who recruited Jake to work for your company. The person who's had access to your research, your schedule, your personal life." The realization hit Mark like a physical blow. "My business partner, David." The underground parking garage beneath Mark's office building felt like a mausoleum at midnight. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting dancing shadows between the concrete pillars. Mark's footsteps echoed in the emptiness as he made his way toward the elevator, Sarah's warning replaying in his mind like a broken record. David Chen had been his roommate at MIT, his co-founder, his best man. The idea that David could betray him felt like being told gravity had stopped working, but the evidence was undeniable. The security footage Sarah had shown him on her laptop. David entering Mark's office after hours, copying files to an encrypted drive. The bank records showing large deposits to offshore accounts, phone logs connecting him to known associates of Viktor Kozlov. Mark pressed his keycard against the elevator scanner, his hands shaking slightly. He had to confront David, had to hear it from his lips. The elevator climbed silently to the 32nd floor, and when the doors opened, Mark stepped in too. The reception area of Evans Chen Technologies. The space that had once felt like home now felt like foreign territory. Light spilled from under David's office door. Mark walked slowly down the hallway, noting details he'd never paid attention to before, the way David's office was positioned to overlook Mark's. The security camera that had mysteriously malfunctioned during the time periods when files were copied. How many signs had he missed? He pushed open the door without knocking. David looked up from his computer, his face cycling through surprise, guilt, and finally settling on resignation. He was smaller than Mark remembered, shoulders permanently hunched from years of coding, his hair thinning at 28. "I wondered when you'd figure it out," David said quietly. Mark stood in the doorway, unable to move further into the room. "How long? Since the beginning?" David's voice was steady, matter of fact. "The day we signed the Meridian contract, I made a call to some old contacts. People who appreciate the value of information. Viktor Kozlov." David nodded, among others. Mark finally stepped into the office, closing the door behind him. "Why?" David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "At this office, this building, this life we built, it's our life. We built it together." "No," David's voice turned sharp. "We built your life. Your name on the patents, your face in the magazines, your algorithm that's worth billions." He gestured to the framed articles on the wall, all featuring Mark as the brilliant young entrepreneur. "I've been invisible from the start." Mark felt like he was falling. "That's not true. You're my partner. I'm your employee, Mark. I always have been 49% ownership versus 51%. You made sure you'd always have final say. That was just for legal purposes, was it?" David stood and Mark saw something in his eyes that made his chest tighten. "Is it legal purposes when you decided to pursue the government contract without consulting me? Is it legal purposes when you negotiated the terms alone and you made the decision to integrate Emma's accident data into the algorithm without asking if I was comfortable profiting from your dead sister's tragedy?" The words hit Mark like physical blows. "David, I mourned her too, you know? Emma was my friend. But you turned her death into a business opportunity and expected me to smile and go along with it." Mark's hands clenched into fists. "That algorithm will save lives. Will it? Or will it just make you feel better about not being in that car?" The room went dead silent, except for the hum of computers and the distant sound of traffic 32 floors below. "You don't know what you're talking about," Mark said quietly. "Don't I? I've watched you torture yourself for 3 years. Watched You throw yourself into work to avoid dealing with your guilt. Watched you build walls around yourself so high that nobody can reach you. David moved around the desk, closer to Mark. I've watched you take credit for work that we did together. While acting like you're some kind of tragic genius? Mark's vision blurred around the edges. So you decided to sell me out to criminals. I decided to finally get what I'm worth. What about the people Kozlov will hurt if he gets the algorithm? What about the governments that could fall if he can predict and manipulate disasters? David's expression flickered, and for a moment, Mark saw something that might have been doubt. Then it was gone. That's not my problem. It's not your problem. Mark's voice rose. David, this algorithm could be used to cause the exact kind of accidents that killed Emma. It could kill thousands of people, and maybe you shouldn't have built it. The words hung in the air like a curse. Mark stared at his oldest friend, trying to find some trace of the man he'd trusted with his life. But the person standing in front of him was a stranger. What happens now? Mark asked. David glanced at his computer screen where Mark could see an encrypted chat window open. Now you have a choice. You can cooperate with Mr. Kozlov's organization voluntarily, or you can wait for the FBI to arrest you for treason tomorrow morning. You set up the treason charges too? I provided certain evidence that suggested you'd been selling classified information. Bank records, communications, travel, patterns. David shrugged. It wasn't difficult to manufacture a convincing case. Mark felt the walls closing in around him. And if I cooperate with Kozlov, then the evidence disappears, and you get to keep your freedom while building something truly revolutionary. Revolutionary? Mark laughed bitterly. You mean destructive? I mean profitable. Mark pulled out his phone and held up the screen showing the kill switch code. What if I told you I could destroy the entire algorithm right now? Make all of this worthless? David's eyes widened, then narrowed. You're bluffing, am I? David reached for his desk drawer, and Mark saw the gun before David's hand closed around it. I really hoped it wouldn't come to this, David said. Pointing the weapon at Mark's chest, put the phone down. Mark's heart hammered against his ribs, but his voice remained steady. You're going to shoot me in our office building? There are cameras everywhere. There are blind spots. I made sure of that. Mark took a step closer to the desk. David, think about what you're doing. We've been friends for 10 years. Friends don't lie to each other about partnerships. Friends don't take all the credit for shared work. David's hand trembled slightly. Around the gun. Friends don't build their success on other people's bones. What about Emma? She loved you like a brother. David's face crumpled for just a moment, and Mark saw the man he used to know buried under years of resentment and betrayal. Don't, David whispered. Don't use her memory as a weapon. I'm not. I'm reminding you who you used to be. They stood in silence for a long moment, the gun wavering between them. Then David's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He glanced at it without lowering the weapon. Kozlov's people are in the building, he said. They're coming up now. Mark felt ice flood his veins. You called them? Told them you'd be. Here, David, please, you don't understand what you've done. David's expression hardened again. I understand perfectly. I finally stopped being your shadow. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made them both freeze. But the voice that called out wasn't what either of them expected, Mark. David, I know you're both in there. Sarah's voice carried clearly through the door. David's gun swung toward the sound. How did she? The lights went out. The darkness. Mark heard the office door open, the sound of David's chair scraping against the floor. And Sarah's voice calm and deadly. David, I need you to put the gun down now. Who are you? David's voice was high with panic. The person who's been keeping Mark alive for the past 6 hours. And you're the person who's about to get us all killed. Mark heard movement. In the darkness, the soft whisper of fabric against concrete, and the building is surrounded, Sarah continued. Kozlov's people, federal agents, and a private military contractor that neither of us want to meet. We have maybe 3 minutes before. This room becomes a war zone. Wait, I made a deal, David said. Kozlov promises whatever he needs to promise to get what he wants. Then he eliminates loose ends. Sarah's voice moved through the darkness like smoke. Guess what you are now, David? A sound from the hallway made them all freeze Heavy footsteps. Multiple sets. "Mark," Sarah said quietly, "we need to go now." "What about David?" In the darkness, Mark heard the gun clatter to the floor. "David's coming with us," Sarah said, "whether he wants to or not." The footsteps in the hallway stopped outside the office door. The maintenance shaft between floors was barely wide enough for one person, let alone three. Mark crawled through the darkness behind Sarah, his knees scraping against metal, while David brought up the rear, his breathing sharp and panicked. Behind them, Mark could hear voices echoing through the office they'd just abandoned. Russian accents mixed with federal agents shouting orders, the sound of furniture being overturned. "How far?" Mark whispered. "2 more levels down," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the impossible situation. "There's an exit that leads to the subway tunnels." They crawled in silence for another 10 minutes, the metal shaft growing colder as they descended. Mark's hands were numb, his shoulders burning from the confined space. But what hurt worse was the weight of David's betrayal, settling into his bones like poison. Finally, Sarah stopped at what looked like a dead end. She pressed her palms against the metal wall, and a section swung inward on hidden hinges. They tumbled out into what appeared to be an abandoned subway platform. Emergency lighting cast everything in sickly yellow, revealing rusted train tracks disappearing into tunnels that hadn't seen service in decades. "Where are we?" David asked, his voice echoing in the empty space. "The old pneumatic postal system," Sarah said, helping Mark to his feet. "They used to send mail through pressurized tubes under the city, which people forgot it exists." Mark dusted off his jacket, trying to process what had just happened. "How did you know we were in trouble?" Sarah's expression was unreadable in the dim light. "I've been monitoring communications. When Kozlov's team moved on your building, I knew we were out of time." "You saved us," David said quietly. Sarah turned to him, and Mark saw something dangerous flash in her eyes. "I saved Mark. You're here because leaving you behind would have been murder." David flinched as if she'd slapped him. "Sarah," Mark said, "what's our next move?" She checked her watch. "We have maybe an hour before they trace our exit route. After that, every law enforcement agency in the city will be looking for us." "We run?" "No." Sarah's voice was firm. "Running just delays the inevitable. Kozlov will never stop hunting you, and the federal charges won't disappear. We need to end this." Mark felt his stomach drop. "End this how?" Sarah walked to the edge of the platform, staring down the abandoned tunnel. "We give Kozlov what he wants. The algorithm." David stepped forward. "But you said I said we give him what he wants. I didn't say we give him what he expects." Mark understood immediately. The kill switch, more than that. Sarah turned back to them, and in the emergency lighting, she looked like a warrior preparing for battle. "We're going to deliver the algorithm personally, along with a few modifications." "What kind of modifications?" Sarah smiled, and Mark saw the dangerous intelligence operative again. "The kind that will destroy Kozlov's entire operation from the inside out." David shook his head frantically. "You're talking about suicide?" "Kozlov's compound is a fortress. Even if we could get inside, we don't need to break in," Sarah said, "because you're going to get us invited." David's face went white. "You're going to call Kozlov and tell him you have Mark and the algorithm, that you're ready to complete the transaction. He'll kill us all the moment we walk in the door. Not if he thinks he's getting what he wants." Sarah pulled out her phone and showed them a screen full of code. "I spent the last 3 months learning everything about Mark's work. I can create a convincing replica of the algorithm that will pass initial testing." Mark studied the code, impressed despite everything. "This is good, really good, but not perfect," Sarah said. "Which is why we only need it to work long enough to get close to Kozlov, and then..." Sarah's expression grew cold. "Then we activate Mark's kill switch and bring down Kozlov's entire network." David was shaking his head. "This is insane. Even if it works, we'll never get out alive." "Maybe not," Sarah said quietly. "But Emma's algorithm won't be used to hurt innocent people." The mention of his sister's name hit Mark like a physical blow. He thought about the 3 years he'd spent building something that was meant to prevent tragedies like her death. The idea that it could be turned into a weapon that caused similar tragedies made him sick. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice softer now. "Something I haven't told you." Mark looked at her, seeing vulnerability crack through her armor. For the first time, Kozlov isn't just interested in your algorithm for profit. He's planning to use it to trigger a series of disasters that will destabilize global markets. Stock crashes, infrastructure failures, natural disaster response delays. People will die, Mark. Thousands of them. The weight of that revelation settled on Mark's shoulders like a lead blanket. When? The operation launches in 72 hours? Mark closed his eyes, seeing Emma's face in the darkness. What would she tell him to do? "There's one more thing," Sarah said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "If we do this, if we get close enough to activate the kill switch, the feedback will destroy more than just Kozlov's network. It'll fry every connected system within a 5-mile radius, including any phones, pacemakers, or life support systems." David stared at her. "You're talking about an electromagnetic pulse. I'm talking about collateral damage that we can't control or predict." Mark opened his eyes. How many people could die? I don't know, maybe dozens, maybe hundreds. The platform fell silent, except for the distant sound of water dripping and the hum of emergency lighting. "So our choices are," Mark said slowly, "let Kozlov kill thousands with my algorithm, or kill hundreds trying to stop him." Yes. Mark thought about Emma again, about the accident that had taken her life, about the algorithm he'd built to prevent such tragedies. It's about how twisted it had become in the hands of people like Kozlov and David. "It's a third option," he said finally. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" Mark pulled out his phone and opened the kill switch program. "I destroy the algorithm right now. Here, make it all worthless." "Mark, no." David stepped forward. "Think about what you're doing. Years of work. Emma's legacy." "Emma's legacy. Emma's legacy isn't an algorithm," Mark said, his finger hovering over the activation key. "It's the idea that some things are more important than personal gain." Sarah watched him carefully. "If you destroy it now, Kozlov will still come after you. He'll assume you're hiding copies. Then I'll spend the rest of my life running." "It'll look like—" "Spend the rest of our lives running," Sarah corrected. "Because I'm not leaving you to face this alone." The words hit Mark with unexpected force. In the space of 12 hours, this woman had gone from stranger to ally to something that felt dangerously close to essential. "Why?" he asked. "Why are you willing to risk everything for someone you just met?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of old pain. "Because 5 years ago, I had a chance to stop something terrible from happening. A weapons deal that I knew would end in civilian casualties. And I chose to look the other way because it wasn't my problem." She paused, staring at the dark tunnel ahead. 47 people died in that attack, including a 12-year-old girl who looked just like my sister. Mark felt something shift in his chest. "Sarah, I've been running from that choice ever since, taking jobs that felt increasingly meaningless, building walls around myself so I wouldn't have to care about the consequences." She looked at him directly. "But I can't run from this one, Mark. Not when I have a chance to actually save people instead of getting them killed." David made a sound of disgust. "This is beautiful and all, but you're both insane. Kozlov has resources we can't even imagine. Military training, unlimited funding, connections in governments around the world, which is why we're not going to fight him head on," Sarah said. "We're going to use his arrogance against him." "How?" Sarah moved closer to Mark, her eyes intense. "Kozlov believes he owns people, that everyone has a price. He'll expect David to betray you because that's what people do in his world. He'll expect me to double-cross you both because that's what someone like me does. And he won't expect to damage people to choose each other over survival." Mark stared at her, understanding dawning. "You want us to walk into his trap willingly?" "I want us to become the trap." David laughed bitterly. "And how exactly does that work?" Sarah pulled out a small device that looked like a modified phone. "This is a localized EMP generator, much smaller scale than the kill switch feedback, but targeted. If we can get within 10 feet of Kozlov's central servers, we can fry his entire operation without killing anyone in the surrounding area. What? About the algorithm? Still gets destroyed. But we walk away alive. Mark studied the device. What's the catch? The catch is that someone has to stay behind to activate it manually, and that someone won't make it out. The platform fell silent again. I'll do it, David said suddenly. Mark and Sarah both stared at him. I'll stay behind and activate the device, David continued, his voice growing stronger. This whole mess is my fault. I should be the one to clean it up. David, no. Mark, you were right earlier. Emma wouldn't want her death to be used to hurt people. She wouldn't want you to die trying to fix my mistakes. Mark saw something in David's eyes that he hadn't seen in years. A friend who used. To stay up all night helping him debug code? The man who had held him while he cried after Emma's funeral? There might be another way, Mark said quietly. What if we could trigger the EMP remotely? Sarah shook her head. The device needs to be activated from within the system's core. Otherwise, the electromagnetic shielding will block the pulse. Then we modify the device, build in a timer. How long a timer? We'd need at least 10 minutes to get clear of the building, maybe more if security is tight. Mark thought for a moment. What if we don't need to get clear? What do you mean? What if we bring the building to us? Sarah and David both looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Mark, Sarah said carefully. What are you thinking? Mark smiled, and for the first time in hours it felt genuine. I'm thinking Emma always said the best solutions are the ones nobody sees coming. He turned to David. How much do you remember about the old pneumatic postal system? David frowned. It's been defunct for decades. Why? Because Kozlov's compound in Queens is built on top of one of the old distribution hubs. I've seen the architectural surveys. Understanding dawned on Sarah's face. You want to access his building from below? Want to turn his building into the delivery system? Mark pulled up building schematics on his phone, showing them the layout of Kozlov's compound overlaid, with the old postal tunnel system. If we can get into the tunnels, we can plant the EMP device directly under his servers. When it goes off, it'll fry everything in the building from the inside out. It'll be safely outside when it happens, Sarah added. David studied the plans. It could work. But we'd need access to the old tunnel maps, specialized equipment for breaking through the foundation, and about 6 hours to pull it all together. Sarah finished. Mark checked his watch. Which gives us until dawn. They stood in the emergency lighting of the abandoned platform, 3 people who had been strangers 12 hours ago, now bound together by necessity and something that felt like hope. So we're really doing this, David said. We're really doing this, Mark confirmed. Sarah was already pulling out her phone, making calls to contacts whose names Mark didn't want to know. There's something else, she said as she waited for someone to answer. Something I should have mentioned earlier. Mark's stomach dropped. What now? Sarah's smile was sharp and dangerous and beautiful. I used to date an explosives expert. Dawn broke over Queens like a wound in the sky, all crimson and gold bleeding through the industrial haze. Mark crouched in the tunnel beneath Kozlov's compound, his hands steady, despite the tremor in his chest. The air smelled of rust and old concrete, and somewhere above them, Viktor Kozlov was drinking his morning coffee, unaware that his world was about to end. Sarah worked silently beside him, connecting the modified EMP device to the building's electrical grid with surgical precision. Her fingers moved like a pianist's, each connection deliberate and sure. In the 6 hours since they'd left the subway platform, she had transformed from corporate spy to demolitions expert to something Mark couldn't quite name but found himself unable to look away from. How much longer? David whispered from his position at the tunnel entrance, watching for guards. 2 minutes, Sarah replied without looking up. Mark checked the modified kill switch code on his phone one final time. When the EMP activated, it would simultaneously fry Kozlov's servers and trigger a feedback loop that would destroy every copy of the Meridian algorithm in existence. Emma's work would be gone, but it would die protecting people instead of harming them. Sarah, he said quietly, after this is over. She looked at him, and in the dim light of the tunnel, her eyes held depths he was only beginning to understand. "After this is over," she said, "we disappear. New identities, new lives. Be somewhere warm where nobody asks questions about the past. Together if you want?" Mark realized he did want that. More than he'd wanted anything since Emma died. The thought should have terrified him, but instead, it felt like coming home. Movement above, David hissed from the entrance. Sarah's hand stilled on the device. "Guards? Looks like a shift change. We've got maybe 30 seconds before the next patrol." Sarah resumed working, her movements even faster now. Almost there. Mark's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Kozlov's name appeared on the screen. "Answer it," Sarah whispered. "Keep him talking." Mark pressed accept. "Victor. Mr. Evans." Kozlov's voice was smooth as silk over broken glass. "I understand you've been having some difficulties." "Nothing I can't handle," Kozlov chuckled. "Really, because my sources tell me you spent last night crawling through maintenance shafts like a rat." Mark's blood went cold. "Your sources? Did you really think you could move through this city without me knowing? I own half the surveillance systems, and I have agreements with the people who own the other half." Sarah looked up from the device, her face pale. "What do you want, Victor?" "I want what I've always wanted, your cooperation. And I want it in. The next 60 seconds, or your friend Ms. Miller dies." The line went dead. Mark stared at his phone, trying to process what he'd heard. "Sarah, we need to go. Now." But when he turned, Sarah was gone. "David," where David stepped out of the shadows and Mark saw the gun in his hand. Behind him, Sarah was being held by two men in tactical gear, a knife pressed to her throat. "I'm sorry, Mark," David said, his voice thick with regret. "But some debts can't be repaid with good intentions." Mark felt the world tilt around him. "David, what the hell? Mr. Kozlov made me a better offer," David said. "My freedom and a very comfortable retirement in exchange for delivering you personally. But the tunnel, the plan was exactly what Kozlov wanted us to think. He's been listening to every word." David gestured to a small device clipped to his jacket. Live audio feed. Sarah struggled against her captors, but the knife at her throat kept her still. Her eyes met Mark's, and he saw something there that made his chest tighten. Not fear. Determination. "The device is still active," she said quietly. One of Kozlov's men backhanded her, but not before Mark understood. The EMP was armed. All it needed was the activation signal. "David," Mark said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind, "this isn't you, isn't it?" David's laugh was bitter. "I've been living in your shadow for 10 years, Mark. Watching you take credit for our work. Watching you build an empire on ideas we developed together. Watching you turn Emma's death into a business opportunity. That's not what I did, isn't it? The Meridian Project exists because your sister died. Every dollar we've made, every contract we've signed, every line of code we've written has been built on her grave." Mark felt something crack inside his chest. "Emma would have wanted us to save lives. Emma would have wanted you to grieve, like a normal person, instead of building monuments to your guilt." The words hit Mark like physical blows, but he forced himself to stay focused. Sarah was still alive. That was what mattered. What happens now? David glanced at his watch. "Now we go upstairs and meet Mr. Kozlov. He's very eager to discuss the future of your algorithm. And Sarah? Sarah dies. Doesn't leave loose. Ends." Mark looked at the woman who had saved his life, who had chosen to risk everything for people she'd never met, who had offered him something he'd never expected to find. "David," he said quietly, "I need you to know something." "What?" "I forgive you." David's face crumpled. "Mark and Emma would forgive you too." The gun in David's hand wavered. "But I can't let you do this." Mark pulled out his phone and hit the activation key for the kill switch. The effect was immediate and devastating. Every electronic device in a 100-foot radius sparked and died. The lights went out. The ventilation systems shut down. And somewhere above them, Victor Kozlov's empire began to collapse. But Mark had miscalculated. The EMP pulse was stronger than expected, and the feedback loop Sarah had warned him about began immediately. Electricity arced through the tunnel like liquid lightning. "Everyone out," Sarah shouted, breaking free from her captors in the confusion. But as they ran toward the tunnel entrance, Mark realized the terrible truth. The pulse was building toward a catastrophic discharge. In less than 30 seconds, the entire building would be consumed by an electromagnetic storm that would kill everyone inside, including the innocent people in the surrounding area. Mark stopped running. "Sarah, take David and get out of here." "What?" "No, Mark. Come on. The pulse is going to overload. If I don't stay here and channel it through the building's ground system, it'll spread 4 blocks. Sarah turned back, her face desperate in the emergency lighting. "There has to be another way." "There is no other way." Mark moved to the EMP device, which was now sparking violently. He could see the manual override switch. If he could reach it, he could direct the pulse downward into the earth instead of outward into the city. But he'd have to hold the switch in place manually. And when the pulse discharged, anyone touching the device would be electrocuted instantly. "Mark, don't do this," Sarah pleaded. "Take care of David," Mark said, his hand moving toward the switch. "He made bad choices, but he's not a bad person." "Mark, I know," he said, meeting her eyes. "I know." He thought about Emma in those final seconds, about the accident that had taken her life and the guilt that had driven him for 3 years, about the algorithm that was meant to prevent tragedies, but had nearly caused them instead, about Sarah, who had shown him that some people were worth risking everything for, about David, who had been lost in resentment but might still find his way back, about the thousands of people who would live because Kozlov's network was destroyed. Mark grabbed the override switch. The world exploded into light. When Sarah woke up in the hospital 3 days later, David was sitting beside her bed. His left arm was in a sling, and his face was mapped with small cuts from flying debris, but he was alive. "Jack," she whispered. David's eyes filled with tears. They found him at the manual override. The doctor said it was instantaneous. Sarah closed her eyes and let the grief wash over her. Outside her window, New York continued its endless dance of life and death and rebirth, unaware that it had been saved by a man who finally understood what his sister had always known. Some things are worth dying for. The Meridian algorithm was gone, destroyed so completely that no trace remained. Viktor Kozlov's network had collapsed, his servers fried, his operations in chaos. The federal charges against Mark were dropped posthumously when investigators discovered the evidence of David's manipulation. David used his inheritance from the company to establish the Emma Evans Foundation, dedicated to preventing accidents through community safety programs rather than predictive algorithms. Sarah disappeared from the hospital before the FBI could question her, leaving behind only a note for David. "Take care of yourself. He believed in you." She was never seen again. But sometimes, on Tuesday mornings at Mount Hebron Cemetery, fresh flowers appeared on Emma Evans' grave, and occasionally witnesses reported seeing a woman with dark hair standing in the distance. Watching as David knelt beside his old friend's headstone, asking forgiveness and promising to do better, Mark Evans died as he had lived in those final months, trying to save people he'd never met. But unlike the accident that had taken his sister, his death was a choice, a sacrifice made with open eyes and a clear heart. In the end, he had learned what Emma had always known. Love isn't about avoiding loss. It's about choosing what's worth losing everything for. The end.